I'm your host, Anju Gattani, and I am so excited today that if I run out of breath, don't be surprised because we have the author of this book, Story Trumps Structure, with us today. This is a master craft storyteller at his peak. His name is Stephen James. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you for having me here.
So excited to have you. As you can tell, I'm running out of words because I don't know how to introduce you. Because if you have to go on Stephen James's website to understand his accomplishments, what he's achieved and the master level he's at, because his book has helped me and my series, considering how confused I was several years ago over the course of hundreds of rejections. And I used to think, am I a character writer, a character-driven writer? Am I a plot-driven writer? Do I need to fall in a category? Do I need to fit on a shelf? Does my storytelling ability have to fit somewhere? And basically, Stephen says it very, very nicely in a nutshell. All story is driven by tension. And when I read that, I was like, So it's not even a problem if I'm writing about multicultural characters in a multicultural setting. I've got to keep the tension going, which is what will keep readers turning the page. And that just dispelled a whole lot of confusion and self-doubt. So anyway, sorry, back to Stephen James. As usual, I got sidetracked. Who is Stephen James? He is master storyteller. He is a national best-selling author whose award-winning, pulse-pounding novels continue to gain wide critical acclaim from sources including Publishers Weekly, the New York Journal of Books, RT Book Reviews, Booklist, Library Journal, and many more. He has received more than a dozen national and international honors and awards for his books, including 4 Christie Awards and an International Book Award for Best Suspense. His articles and stories have appeared in more than 80 different publications, including Writer's Digest magazine and the New York Times. Equipped with a unique master's degree in storytelling, James has taught writing and storytelling on 4 continents over the past 2 decades, speaking more than 2,000 times at events spanning the globe. Not only is James a prolific story writer, master storyteller, he is an empowerment speech giver. In his ability to talk to corporates and help them understand how the power of storytelling can really help them move forward. So welcome, Stephen. We're so honored to have you on our little YouTube channel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to pick off from where we left off on the first video, which was we're talking about conflict and tension, and you really explained that the two do have a difference. They're not the same, which is a lot of confusion that a lot of writers have.
I think that a lot of people have been taught that a story needs conflict, so they just add more bad stuff happening. The character, has a broken leg and then walks outside as a hurricane, sweeps their dog away. And then they find out they have a, cancer diagnosis during their divorce. And you're just like, this is horrible, like plenty of conflict, and bad things happening. But it isn't so much just about adding more and more stuff that goes wrong, but focusing on what they want the most and then making that more difficult for them to get. So that's where the tension comes from. That's where it's from, that desire to get something or have something. It isn't just about a bunch of bad things occurring to your character.
Right. And you talk about that in this book. And for those of you who haven't seen the cover, again, here it is, a must buy, absolute must buy. I wanted to ask you about, when we look at our story, we're always told, the inciting incident or the inciting event that creates the initial tension in the novel must be so gripping. And you've explained that really well, because you also say that as writers, we're competing with a lot of media out there for attention and time. So my question is, how do we raise the bar of that inciting tension or conflict to get the reader to orient him to our story world and turn the page?
So it's a good question. The hook, or grabbing the attention of our readers, is important. It's one aspect, I think, of what really needs to happen early on in a story. And I don't know how to say exactly that, one line. Certainly we can have a gripping first sentence that can, draw readers in. But very often what will happen is we need a character that readers care about, that they want to cheer for. So basically, a story will very often begin with one of three characters: the villain, the victor, the hero, or a victim, something bad that happens. So typically stories will begin, and readers kind of know this. They're like, okay, I'm reading this story and I think that this is the villain or the main character, or maybe the character gets killed off early on in the story, like the first chapter they die or whatever. So stories typically, but not always, but typically open in those ways. And so we have certain expectations. When we open a book, we expect that whoever is introduced first will be important to the story. We don't really love it if they're introduced and we hear their whole history and then they get killed off at the end of the first chapter, but that does happen in some cases. I was teaching in New York City at this at Thriller Fest for suspense writers. And so this one author, I was doing a master class on thriller writing, and this one author had started his book with the introducing a character and having her get killed off at the end of the first chapter. This serial killer was after her and he catches and kills her. And I said, that's so commonly used. I was like, you really don't want to start with a cliche. And he goes, but everybody does it. I'm thinking, exactly what makes it a cliche, right? So everybody does do that. So you don't want to do that because that's what everyone else is doing. So if you want to grab the attention of an agent or an editor, you want to tell your story in a fresh way. So you don't want to do just exactly what everyone else is doing. Certainly start with something intriguing, maybe an opening line or paragraph, but immediately introduce us to a character that we can cheer for or admire or fear. One of those three things is typically what we want the early part of the story to do.
Okay. And then once we've established that and we know how we want to set the internal and external conflict, we know what our character wants and is not going to get immediately. So we fulfill that tension to achieve a goal as well. How do we then take that tension, which we've established, and start escalating it to a point that it works and it's doing the job it should be?
Let's talk about it in terms of suspense. There are different things that lead a reader to flip the page. Okay, so there really are five. One is curiosity. Wonder who did it. I wonder where this is going. I wonder who the killer is or whatever. So curiosity. Second is concern. I'm really worried about what's going to happen to this character, or her son was abducted. Is he going to be all right? We're worried about concern. And the third is anticipation. It's not so much that we're curious. It's not so much that we're worried, but we're looking forward to something. And the fourth is the engagement, the entertainment value of what we're reading. We're not really worried. We're not really concerned or looking forward. We're just enjoying the story right now, and we just want it to keep going. And of course, the last one we want to avoid, and that's obligation. This is where someone says, I'm going to finish this book. Why? Because I started it. And I think we've all heard that, and we want to avoid that. That's not where we're going. So we have these four really to choose from: curiosity, concern, anticipation, and I guess I would say the entertainment value of the moment that you're reading. So to create tension, we're going to focus on the second of those four. Concern. That is concern. And so how do you build up the concern or the tension, the suspense or whatever for the readers? There are four things that work together to create that, to create a moment of worry, concern, tension, suspense, however you want to phrase it. And basically the first is reader empathy. This is where we identify with that character. So if we read about a character we have nothing in common with, or no shared values or no shared goals or or wounds or anything, it'll be harder for us to identify with them. So making it clear early on how we could identify with them. That's one, reader empathy. Second is reader concern. This is a character that we want to live happily ever after, or we want to cheer for them. If we don't really care about the character, we're not going to feel tension. We're just going to feel like get them off the page and kill them off or whatever. So you have reader empathy, reader concern, then impending danger. This is where we see peril is coming. So for instance, it doesn't need to be physical peril. It could be something we care about is in danger. Maybe it's their psychological, well-being. Maybe it's their relational well-being. We're worried about whether or not they'll find the love of their life, whatever it is. So we have this impending danger or peril. And then the final is escalating danger or escalating tension. And so as you move through the story, you're focusing on one or more of these four aspects: building up reader empathy or re-identification with them, building up the concern that we have because we really want this character to succeed or find happiness or fulfillment, whatever it is, or we sharpen the peril that is right around the corner, the danger, or we tighten the tension by showing how they want something and can't get it, and what are the stakes. So stakes are consequences. If ever someone says, what are the stakes in this story? It just means, what are the consequences of the character not getting what they want?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Wow, that's definitely milestones that we can mark as we start thinking through our story pattern and where we're heading. And I know a lot of what you mentioned translates to external conflict and the external movement of story in terms of the outside of it. But how do we as writers translate that to also affect the character on an internal note? Because a lot of your book also focuses on the internal conflict or tension and interpersonal relationships and the stresses of those in the story.
So again, the tension will come from desire that's unmet.
Mhm.
So understanding what your character is desiring. And so, okay, so let me put it this way. When you know what your character fears, you'll also know what they desire.
Desire. Okay.
When you know what they desire, you'll also know what they fear. So you say, what are you talking about? Well, for instance, if I fear loneliness, then I'll desire companionship. If I fear, maybe being imprisoned in some way, then I desire freedom. And so by understanding what your character fears, you'll understand what they desire. And very often in a story, you will make the character face what? His greatest fear.
Greatest fear.
Yeah. So very often, once we understand what it is that this character is desiring, and very often that is internal, it doesn't need to be external. It doesn't need to be saving the world or something like that. It can be finding identity. It can be finding purpose, finding meaning, finding hope. All of these things characters can desire, and readers can cheer for them along that pursuit. So it's sharpening that. It's allowing the stakes to be high enough so that if the character doesn't get what they want, something it matters. It matters to the character and to readers.
Now, how about when that gets more complicated with interpersonal relationships? Because now we've got 2, 3, 4 key players, and especially in stories, some of the real bigger stories where it's not just the main character who has a goal or an agenda, but one, obviously the protagonist, but the antagonist also, and then sometimes secondary characters, they also have their own agendas. And they all lead to life on the page. And so you're rooting for everybody, even though you know that 2 or 3 of them are not really that positive, but as we're told as writers, characters of shades of gray. We're not all good, not all evil. So how does that interplay work with interpersonal relationships?
Well, typically when you have, let's say, two characters in a scene, let's just start with two. You have two characters in the scene. Well, typically they'll have what I call, this is just the way I remember it. Instead of hag, H-A-G, a history, an attitude, and a goal.
Okay.
Or the other characters. So for instance, let's say that your character has a history with this character. They grew up together. They have an attitude toward them. They're in love or they're angry or whatever it might be. And they have a goal. Maybe it's to punish the person for what they said 10 years ago, back whenever they were growing up, or whatever that goal might be. But remember that each of them will have the history, attitude, and goal toward every other character in the scene. So sometimes in my writing seminars, I will bring four people up front. I'll say, okay, imagine that you are at a dinner party. And I said, look around to these other four people that are up front. One of them you are in love with. One of them you're afraid of. And one of them just last week ran over your cat. Now, okay, so you have these four people up here. And each one of those four is going to have one person they're in love with, one person they're afraid of, and one that ran over the cat. Now, they're not going to tell the rest of the people in the audience what it is. So then we do this improv. Okay, so I say, all right, pretend that John, you are hosting this party. So go ahead and open the door. Amy shows up. So Amy comes in. And by the way that they act, interact, what they say, how they move, then the audience is going to try and guess.
Yes.
What their attitude was toward the other characters. So it can be just pretty humorous, especially if you have a character who's like in love with another character. That character is afraid of this one. And the closer they get, the more they move away or whatever it is. And so then at the end, after we've all tried to guess each of the relationships for all of those four actors, then I'll say, now, would this be a difficult scene to write? And people say, yes. That would be so hard to write. And then I'll say, and that's what you're doing on every page in every scene in every chapter of your book. Because as you mentioned, there is a web of relationships that a character will be in each scene. And so if a character treats everyone else the exact same way, as if he has no attitude, history, or goal regarding that other character, the story will fall flat.
Yeah.
It won't be interesting. And so it's crucial as we, as authors, look at the scenes that we're writing. If you have two characters, four characters, however many you have in the scene, remember that every one of them has those three factors involved with the relationship with each other character. Keeping track of those in your mind and in your mind is a trick.
It's like juggling. It's like juggling, and it's not just juggling one or two balls. It's like all the characters all at the same time. Because even though some of them step away from the scene for a while, they're still there in the story. They haven't gone.
Yeah. And they still have those attitudes and goals toward the other characters, even if they aren't in the scene. So when they return to the story, they will have something that they're hoping to accomplish or an attitude that they have toward this character. Maybe it's like they come back and they're thinking, I'm in love with this person and I need to tell them. While meanwhile, the other person's thinking, this person I need to fire because I'm his boss or whatever. And so he's trying to tell her he loves her and she's trying to come up with the right words to say you're fired. And so all of that creates, again, that tension that you've talked about before.
Wow. That's an eye-opener. That really is, because it's what we are told right from the beginning: show, don't tell. And then how do you show the action of the characters who are playing, and then of course reveal their intent without telling, especially when you've got a web of characters. Yes.
Now that's interesting. This is very often taught, show, don't tell. And I totally get where people are coming from. I think there's a time to tell, time to show. And basically the simplest I know to put it is like this. When it comes to emotion, show.
Show.
Yeah. So for instance, he walked into the room, he pounded the table, kicked the chair across, skittering across the linoleum and said, "Get out, I never want to see you again." You then don't need to tell the readers he was angry because you've shown us. And it's almost insulting then for you to tell us what we've already attuned from reading it. Okay, so when it comes to emotion, you show. But when it comes to intention, I feel like it's very often best to simply tell. So for instance, a character could walk into a scene and he could say, "I'm here for the $500 you owe me, and I'm not leaving until I get it." That's telling. Then that's totally appropriate. That's his intention. So when it comes to emotion, show. When it comes to intention, tell. So you could have a character say, "What are you even doing here anyway?" He's like, "I'm here because I'm looking for my daughter. Have you seen her?" Okay, now we know. That's telling. So sometimes people get kind of all wrapped up trying to figure out, how can I show this intention? And sometimes it's better to just tell. Now, sometimes it's clear from the context. So for instance, if a character gets a ransom note and their daughter's missing, they get a ransom note and immediately they go to the bank. We don't need to be told he's getting money to pay off the ransom, right? Context makes that super clear. So in that case, you wouldn't have to really tell us. Or let's say that someone that he loves has been killed. Then he goes out at night searching for someone in a back alley and he buys a gun illegally. Well, we get the idea he's probably after the people that killed his loved one. He's going to enact revenge. So he probably doesn't have to say, "I am here to take revenge." He may, but probably doesn't need to. So when it comes to emotion, show. When it comes to intention, lean toward having the character state as clearly as possible what it is that they want in that scene.
So here's a question piggybacking off what you just said. And this is something I actually think about a lot when I'm writing my story, because I'm not sure, and when I'm gauging a scene, how to sometimes, should I be telling or showing the scene in slow motion? And how slow to make it so that, one, I'm continually escalating the tension of the story without flatlining it, but at the same time, giving the depth that that scene requires. And does that scene require as much depth as what I'm thinking? And should I just, make it a little lighter? How do we gauge?
Well, one way to build up that suspense or tension, creating moments where we worry about the character if they'll get what they want or not. One way to do that is to really focus on, okay, so let me think here. What was I just lost my train of thought immediately as I started saying that. Repeat your question one last time, just for me, because I just got a brain burp and I can't remember exactly what I was going to say. Just focus me back for 1 second. Go ahead.
Not a problem. So when I'm writing a scene, and this is a personal situation.
I remember now. Okay. So sorry. So sometimes it's helpful to just think of it this way. I'm going to stretch out the parts most people shrink, and I'm going to shrink the parts most people stretch out. So to create that interest, very often people will spend a lot of time talking, I don't know, I mean, let's just say his outfit, like they'll spend 3 or 4 sentences describing his outfit and all this, and some of that just doesn't matter maybe. But then they'll skip over those moments where we know that there's peril, and they'll try to get to the conclusion faster. They'll try to get to the resolution beforehand. So what I'm going to say is, let's say we're looking at the scene. Okay, I want you to stretch out those parts that most people might skip over to get to the resolution. That's going to milk those moments for suspense. Then also, as far as just the static sort of descriptions and stuff, we're going to kind of skip over those a little bit more. So one way to look at it is this, that every scene, not every single scene, but let's just say every scene, there are 3 things that you use to tell that story. There's dialogue, there's description, and narration or exposition, some people will say. So there's three things. We can have dialogue. We could have a whole scene of dialogue probably, but we'll probably have some description to allow us to see the setting and care about the setting, and probably some exposition or narration to tell us what's happening. So we have action, description, dialogue. So in order to create more of the suspense, you can either create more of an evocative, sort of emotion-filled setting through description. So you would choose details that evoke something in line with the mood that you're trying to create. So for instance, you wouldn't say maybe there was a red sign. Who cares if it was a red sign? That means nothing really. Yeah. But you could say the sign had been painted red long ago and now looked like it was the color of dried blood. That's evocative. Now we're like, this is going to probably be an intense scene, something like that.
Well, it's bringing in the perception of the character who's looking at that red as well. So
yeah, I mean, yeah, very often descriptions do come from that specific point of view of that character within the scene. Sometimes I tell people, the goal of description is not to describe, it's to evoke.
No.
So yeah, so the more details that can be evocative in that way to create the tension for the scene. And then also to draw out the action so that, as this character is crossing the room, what's he thinking? What's going through his mind? What's behind that door? So all of those techniques can be used. The final one that comes to my mind for your scene that you're talking about is the potential to use point of view flips. I don't know how many point of views you have in your story or how many you might be using, but very often to create suspense, authors will use more than one point of view. And the reason is to create dramatic irony, to allow the reader to be aware of danger that the character is not aware of. So for instance, we might have a scene where we see this, the villain enters the home, this person's home, starts to root around through the home in the darkness. Then we flip to this character driving along the dirt road toward his house. And he's driving along, maybe glances at the phone, has some calls to make as soon as he gets there. And he turns onto the long driveway toward his home. Flip back to our bad guy inside. He sees the car coming up the driveway, walks over, grabs a knife from the knife block, stands behind the door, the front door, and waits. Now the person gets out of the car. We're flipping back to their point of view. They grab their phone and the car keys or the house keys. They walk up the path toward the house and they insert the key into the lock. And what are readers thinking? Don't open the door. He's right on the other side. The killer's got a knife. Don't open the door. Don't open the door. Okay. Why? Because we as readers are aware of peril. Remember we talked about impending peril and so on. Yeah, that the character is not aware of. So that's one reason why you'll often find this technique used in suspense writing. Suspense and thrillers very often have multiple point of views. It's not just for no reason at all. It's for that very specific reason that it can be used to create lots of suspense and worry, apprehension within that scene.
Well, that's something to think about for sure. And I'm sure it, when I'll sit back and apply it to the scene, with all that you've said, I'll be able to gauge better in terms of what requires more weight versus less weight, and what's the momentum of the story I'm dealing with at that point. And just asking about, the cycle of story and its movement. And of course, us as writers trying not to flatline our stories, but to try and keep the escalation going. How should, or is there a movement or a cycle of tension in story? Is there one?
Yeah, stories move, through scenes that build up acts, that build up stories. Now, I am not of the perspective that you need 3 acts for a story. I don't believe in that. I don't teach that because it's just simply not true. Some stories have 2 acts, some have 1. Some have 3, 4, more, 5. All stories. That's why that book is called Story Trumps Structure. And the whole idea is that story is much more important than the number of acts, yes, that you might include. Okay, so all that being said, that scenes build tension through the movement of what we call scenes and interludes. So think of it this way. In a scene, a character has a desire, they have a goal, whatever it is, they face a setback, they'll process what just happened and make a choice that moves to the next scene. So I sometimes think of it this way: seek, fail, process, proceed. So they seek something, fail to get ultimately what they ultimately want until the climax where they get it. Then they have or maybe don't get it. Then they have a choice or processing it, then a choice that leads to the next scene. So for instance, let's just say that you got fired from your job. You have a job as a journalist and so on, and you get fired. Well, what are you going to do? That you have a goal, you're seeking something, this permanent job, and you failed. You've been fired. Now what? Well, you process it. You think, well, maybe I should become a novelist. Maybe I should go back to school, get another degree. Maybe I'll stay home and watch the kids, and my spouse will work, or whatever it is. But you think about that, then you make a choice that leads to the next chapter of your life. You start grad school, you work on your novel, you start caring for the kids. So the reason that stories in fiction move through this process, seek, fail, process, proceed, is because that's exactly what we do in real life. And if a character doesn't do that, it won't seem believable. So if someone comes into my house and I shoot them, protecting my family, and then the next scene just goes on as if nothing has happened, it won't seem believable. Readers will be like, he just killed someone. Yeah. Like, it was justified maybe because the guy was going to hurt his family or whatever, but it's going to affect him somehow. Like, he's just going to go on with life. He's a psychopath. What is that? That doesn't make sense. Okay, so as scenes build, so do the stakes. So as you have one scene where you seek, fail, process, proceed, make a choice, leads to the next scene. And each time through, there might be bigger stakes. There might be more danger. There might be more things that could go wrong or that do go wrong. So sometimes it's good to back up and say, okay, in this scene, what does my character want to accomplish, overcome, avoid, whatever it is? What's going to get in the way of that? How will he process that failure? And then what choice will he make that moves us to the next scene? And that next scene then will build on what just happened.
Just going back to what you said about how the emotional processing of a failure, that takes us to the layer of story that's below the surface, the emotional. How does that move? Or does it have a pattern of movement or at all in story? How does that work? Because as writers, we're not just looking at the surface of story, we're looking at the subsurface and the layers of story that follow. And, a lot of the emotions that the characters then endure also lead to changes in motivation. So how do we tie that in?
Okay, so lots to unpack there. First of all, let's start with the last thing that you mentioned, motivation. Very often, motivation is rooted in backstory. And my view is that motivation is not as important as intention. Okay, so for instance, let's say that you have a scene where there's a character who's been abducted. Now, the bad guy, the villain, wants to kill this person. Your hero, the detective, is trying to save this person. Okay, why is the killer trying to do this? I don't know. Nature, nurture, environmental cues, they grew up. For the scene, it doesn't matter. They have a goal and intention to harm. And whatever their motivation might be, what's most important in the scene is their intention to harm, not the motivation of why. So for instance, also your detective, do you have to get into the backstory and say, he's trying to save this person because this happened 20 years ago when he was in high school? No, what matters in the scene is he's a cop. He's going to protect innocent life or whatever. That's what he does. So what matters the most is intention. And I think a lot of authors get wrapped up with this thing that they have to show the motivation for why this character is the way he is. I'm not a huge proponent of that because I feel like it can drag stories down. And so for for me, whenever I look at a story, I'm asking, what's the intent in this scene? And how would that intent affect the character's choices and attitudes within that scene? Okay, so I never ask myself, what is the motivation of this character?
Right.
But that's me. Some authors find that very helpful. I find that it kind of drags down my scenes when I'm trying to probe into why this character is evil or whatever it might be. Okay. But all I have to say, so that motivation and intention are different. And as an author, it's important to understand the motivation is why they are the way they are. The intention is what they're trying to accomplish in that scene. My perspective, that's always more important than the backstory motivation stuff. So, well, how do you dive deep into the emotions of your character? Well, trying to find universal desires that we all might want to have. So, for instance, as we've mentioned, let's say your character really wants to find love again. Okay, it's a romance story. And so your character is seeking love. To create a story where your character is seeking something like love, you don't create a story based on trying to find instances where he or she can express that love.
Right.
Okay, so basically what I mean is you want to look. Okay, so you have two characters. They both want to be in love, whatever, and they meet each other. They are attracted. Well, why don't they just get together? Why don't they just run off together or whatever? If they did, there would be no tension, no struggle or anything like that. So something has to get in the way. So when we look for love stories, romance, relational based centered stories and so on, we're not looking for ways to bring the couple together. We're actually looking for believable ways to do what?
To keep them apart.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, so the whole brainstorming process is exactly the opposite of what most people do. They try to think, how can I bring these people together? But the exact opposite is what I'm trying to do is keep them believably apart. And then the more we care about the characters, the more we're going to want them to be brought together until there comes a moment at which all seems lost. This is something that over the last few years, I've really been focusing on this moment in my writing and teaching is there comes a moment where all seems lost. There comes a moment where readers are saying, I literally have no idea how this is going to work. Like, how are they going to get together? This is no way. It's impossible. But then to allow the resolution to come in a way that's unexpected, but that is logical based in the story. So it takes people by surprise, but also satisfies them. So that's that moment that's super important. And a lot of people back away from that. They won't drive deep enough into that moment at which all seems lost. They won't go all the way there, or they'll get close to it and kind of have someone else ride in on a steed and solve all the problems and ride off again.
And you've mentioned that in the book, the Machina, and then of course the mentor suddenly coming in out of nowhere and doing the job for them. And I read about it and I was like, that is true.
It's a lot easier to do that.
Yeah.
Much easier. That's why you use so many stories where that happens, where they get the character into this impossible bind where readers are super intrigued. I always say, I can't think of any way that this is going to get resolved. But then someone just comes and solves it for your hero and leaves. Why? Why do we see that so often in movies and television shows and novels? It's not because it's satisfying to readers. It's very unsatisfying. It's not what we want at all, but it's much easier to do that. So what we want to do is find a way to tell our stories in a way so that when we come to that moment, which all seems lost, readers, I don't know what's going to happen. There comes an important choice there on behalf that the main character makes, or probably the main character, or one of the main characters makes an important choice that flips the tables. And then readers say, what? I never saw that coming. Like, seriously? But then when they think about it, they say, I should have seen that coming.
No, the seed was planted before. They just didn't see it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So yes, very often the seed of the climax is planted in the opening scene of the book. Not always, but it's very often. So that it's very satisfying for readers to get to that moment and say, what? No way. And then think back and say, oh, this whole book, I should have been guessing that this is how things would resolve, but I didn't see it. And then we're very satisfied with those types of stories.
And you say that in this book. For all of you who are wondering about that, Stephen actually says it. He says, readers read to try and prove that they are right, but deep inside, they want to be proven wrong.
They want to be wrong, yeah.
And when I read that, that was a game changer, because it just makes you think that is, and that goes back to what you were talking about in the first video, which is about the reader's perspective. Where are they coming from in the story versus you, the writer, who is creating the story?
Yeah, I think I don't know. There are different views about this. I've interviewed a lot of different writers and storytellers for my podcast, The Story Blender. And so over the last 5 years, probably almost 200 different of the leading storytellers in the world have been on my podcast. And so I've asked them, about some of these questions and stuff, different views about story and about audiences. One person said, you should write as if no one will ever read what you write. So that's one view. So in other words, you write it and you free yourself to say, okay, let's just imagine no one's ever going to read this. So I'm just going to write what's really on my heart. I'm just going to write what I really believe this character would do or say or think or act or however. I'm just going to let free reign. I'm going to let him go. That's one view. Another is to write and say, my goal is to always give readers what they want or something better. And this is something I've said over the years, that I want to give readers what they want or something better. And so, of course, the question then is, what do readers want? Well, I get it.
Then we go back to the question of orienting them to the genre. What genre do they want to read?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, of course, books that fall in a genre and then break out of that. And, you can go all over the place.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, when I'm reading a book, or when I'm writing or reading, when I'm writing a book, part of me is asking, if I were the reader, is this what I would want? So for instance, maybe you've seen a television show or a movie that started this way. Maybe you've read a book that starts this way. Super intense moment. Let's say it's on an airplane and a character leaps up and pulls back his shirt. He's got a bomb strapped to him. Your hero is on the plane, rushes forward. They're struggling for the bomb. She's struggling to stop the guy from letting the bomb go off. And right as they both reach for the detonator, the scene stops, and then it says 3 weeks earlier. Now, there's no reader who's reading that, or if it's a movie, who's watching that, who's thinking, man, that's awesome. I can't wait to wait, 10 hours of reading before I find out what happens next. Right. I've never seen that before. That is amazing. There's no reader who's thinking that. There's no one watching a movie who's glad for that. Yeah. Every one of the readers, everyone who's watching that movie is thinking, all right, okay, go on. Let's see where it was 3 weeks. And there's no tension now. Yep. And so I would not do that technique because it's not what readers want. It annoys us when it happens. It annoys me when it happens, when I read it. And people will justify that by saying, well, I'm trying to get them to flip pages. I want them to flip to the next page. Well, I certainly want them to flip to the next page, but I want them to do it not because they have to, but because they want
to.
Yes. I want them to flip the page, not thinking, all right, I got to put up with the next 100 pages before I find out what happens at the climax, which was the first scene. But I want them to think, I can't wait to see what happens. I want to find out what's going on. Reread like that. So, yeah.
Stephen, I could listen to you all day. The stuff I'm hearing from you is stuff which is only half of what you're giving me is in the book. So I'll definitely have to grab the other book now and start reading that to understand more about how to solve my story problems. But it's a phenomenal book for all of you there. And we will have Stephen's podcast link below the video. So I would love for all of you to listen and tune into what he has to say and his audience has to say about storytelling. But this is a book you must buy, an absolute must. Keep it as your writing Bible, your reading Bible, because it will help you cover hundred of milestones without going wrong if you really use the wisdom of Stephen's words. Um, Stephen, would you please share with us a writing or a craft tip before we say goodbyes? 2 or 3,
Sure.
whatever you can share.
Okay, so let's say a writing or craft tip. Okay, so here it is. The first thing that comes to my mind, don't fall in love with your first draft. You may be able to write something publishable in an early draft, 1, 2, 3, 5, whatever it is. Then that's, my hat goes off to you. You're a better writer than I am. I can't do that. It takes me quite a few drafts to get something to where it's like, this really is ready. So what we're tempted to fall in love with it. So I would say when you write something, set it aside, come back to it maybe in a day or 2 or whatever week later. Don't fall in love with it too much, but be ready to adapt and change it as much as possible. And I will mention that if anyone is interested, I do some speaking, as you mentioned, at conferences. And I'll just give you on my website, stephenjames.net is one place to go if you're interested, or fictionninja.com. I do some consulting as well. So you could always check out either one of those.
Yeah, and we have the links below the video for all of those. And I would highly, definitely recommend you check those links out and see for yourself how your stories can be empowered with Stephen's words of wisdom, because they have definitely empowered mine. And this is after hundreds of rejections. I picked up this book and I found the answers to not giving up. And how did I find Stephen? Through Writer's Digest, because he's a very prolific writer. Lots and lots of columns and articles that he has contributed to, which is how I found him in the first place. And, you know, I started tearing out the articles from Writer's Digest, highlighting them. So I would say my highlighter is my best friend when I come across this caliber of work. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much for being with us, for sharing your words of wisdom, and we hope to have you back again.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Good luck to you and all of your listeners.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.